Take it, and forget what you heard. The words landed softly, almost politely, as the envelope slid across the polished oak table, stopping just inches from Clara Bennett's hand. Outside, rain traced quiet lines down the tall glass windows, blurring the city lights into something distant and unreal. Inside, everything felt still. Too still. Clara didn't reach for the envelope. She didn't even look at it right away. Instead, she adjusted the billfold in her hand, aligning its edges with a precision that seemed almost out of place for a waitress nearing the end of a long shift. Her movements were calm, measured, as if nothing unusual had just happened. Adrian Cole watched her closely. He had built an empire by reading people in seconds, tiny shifts in posture, the flicker of hesitation in the eyes, the way fingers tightened around opportunity. Most people leaned forward when money appeared. Most people couldn't help themselves. But Clara didn't move. Not toward the envelope. Not away from it. She simply stood there, the faint hum of the dining room behind her, the quiet clink of silverware and low conversations filling the space between them. It's more than enough, Adrian added, his tone even, almost casual, as if they were discussing a dessert recommendation instead of a secret. Clara finally lowered her gaze, but not to admire the thickness of the envelope. She looked at it the way someone might look at a misplaced object, something that didn't belong where it had been set. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished surface of the table, steady and composed. 27 years old, 8 hours into a double shift. And still, nothing in her expression gave him what he expected. No curiosity, no relief, no calculation. Sir, she said quietly, her voice smooth, professional, but carrying something firmer beneath it. Your receipt is ready. Adrian didn't reach for it. His eyes remained fixed on her face, searching for a crack, a sign, anything that would confirm what he already believed about people. That eventually, everyone chose comfort over principle. That silence, when priced correctly, always had a buyer. Clara placed the billfold gently on the table, just beside the envelope, careful not to disturb it. Her fingers never brushed against the edge, not even by accident. The distance between her hand and the money felt deliberate, like a boundary drawn without words. You understand what I'm asking, Adrian said, his voice lowering slightly now, not threatening, just certain. Some things are better left unspoken. The rain tapped softly against the glass. Somewhere in the restaurant, a glass was set down too hard, the sound echoing briefly before fading. Clara lifted her eyes to meet his. And for the first time since he had spoken, something shifted, not in her posture, but in the air between them. Not defiance, not fear, just clarity. I understand, she replied. And then she paused. Not long, just enough to make the silence feel intentional. Adrian waited, because this was the moment people revealed themselves, the moment they leaned in, or reached out, or hesitated just enough to accept. But Clara didn't lean. She didn't reach. She didn't hesitate. She simply stood there, steady as the rain outside, with a quiet that didn't bend. And for reasons Adrian couldn't immediately explain, that stillness unsettled him more than any refusal ever could. Clara did not step back, but she did not move forward either, and that quiet refusal to react seemed to stretch the moment longer than Adrian expected, long enough for him to notice details he would normally ignore, like the faint crease near her sleeve where the fabric had been pressed too many times, or the way her shoulders remained relaxed instead of tightening under pressure, as if she had already made her decision long before this conversation ever began. Then you know this is the simplest solution, he said, his voice still controlled, still reasonable, because that was how he preferred his power to feel, clean and efficient, never loud, never desperate. Clara nodded once, a small, almost polite gesture, and for a second Adrian thought that was it, that she would take the envelope, that the world would return to its familiar order where problems could be contained and silence could be arranged. But instead of reaching for the money, she reached for the check presenter again, sliding it an inch closer to him, aligning it parallel to the edge of the table with the same careful precision. Your total is printed inside, she said, her tone unchanged, as if she were simply completing a transaction that had nothing to do with the envelope sitting between them. Adrian's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in confusion, because this was not resistance in the way he understood it. There was no defiance, no raised voice, No attempt to bargain or negotiate, just a steady adherence to something he could not immediately quantify. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, leaning back slightly in his chair, studying her now with a different kind of focus, one that was less about control and more about curiosity. Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression composed, almost thoughtful, as if she were weighing his words not for their authority, but for their meaning. "No, sir," she replied softly. "I think I am keeping it exactly as simple as it should be." The rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the windows in a steady rhythm, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence settling in like a third presence at the table. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet choreography, servers moving between tables, glasses refilled, conversations carried on in low tones, unaware that something subtle but significant was shifting in the corner of the room. Adrian glanced down at the envelope again, then back at Clara, as if seeing it differently now, not as a solution, but as a question that had not been answered the way he expected. "Everyone has a line," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, less certain. "It just depends on the number." Clara's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, something that suggested she had heard that belief before and had already decided what she thought of it. "Maybe," she said, "but not every line is for sale." The words were not sharp, not confrontational, but they landed with a weight that lingered, and Adrian felt something unfamiliar stir beneath his calm exterior. Not anger, not frustration, but the faint, unsettling realization that this conversation was no longer following a script he understood. Clara gave a small nod, the kind that signaled the end of an interaction, and turned slightly as if to leave, her attention already shifting back to the responsibilities waiting for her across the dining room. But Adrian did not look away this time, his eyes following her movement, not because he wanted to stop her, but because for the first time in a long while, he was not entirely sure what he had just lost, or what he had just encountered, and that uncertainty stayed with him long after she stepped away from the table, leaving the envelope exactly where it was, untouched, as if it had never mattered at all. Clara moved through the dining room with the same quiet efficiency she had carried all night, her steps measured, her attention steady, as if the conversation at table 12 had never happened, as if there had never been an envelope resting between her and a man who was not used to being ignored, and yet something in the air around her had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment just before a storm changes direction. At the service station, she picked up a fresh pot of coffee, checking the level with a quick glance before stepping toward a nearby table where an elderly couple sat in soft conversation, their hands resting close but not quite touching, the kind of quiet companionship that did not demand attention. "Refill?" she asked gently, her voice returning to its usual warmth, and the woman smiled up at her with a grateful nod, unaware of the silent exchange that had just taken place across the room. Clara poured carefully, not a drop spilling, her focus complete, her presence calm in a way that made people feel at ease without understanding why. Across the room, Adrian remained seated, his hand resting near the envelope, but not on it, his attention no longer on his phone, no longer on the documents that had seemed so urgent an hour ago. Instead, his gaze followed Clara as she moved from table to table, observing the small details he would normally overlook, the way she listened fully when someone spoke, the way she anticipated a request before it was made, the way she corrected a misplaced fork without drawing attention to it. There was no performance in it, no attempt to impress, just a quiet consistency that did not shift depending on who was watching. Adrian had spent years surrounded by people who adjusted themselves to him, voices softening, posture changing, conversations bending to fit his expectations, but Clara had not adjusted at all, not when he spoke, not when he offered money, not even when she walked away. And that lack of adjustment lingered in his mind in a way he could not easily dismiss. At another table, a young server hesitated, holding a tray slightly off balance, her eyes flicking nervously toward a manager standing near the bar, his expression tight with impatience. Clara noticed immediately. She stepped in without announcement, steadying the tray with one hand, her voice low and calm. "Shift your grip slightly to the left," she said, guiding the movement with a precision that suggested experience beyond routine training. The younger server exhaled quietly, her shoulders easing as the tray leveled. "Thank you," she whispered, and Clara gave a small nod, already stepping back, allowing the moment to pass without drawing attention. Adrian watched the exchange carefully, something in it settling deeper than he expected, because there had been no audience for that gesture, no advantage to be gained, no transaction to justify it. It was simply done because it needed to be done. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still, his eyes drifting once more to the envelope, its edges sharp, its presence now feeling less like control and more like a question he had not prepared for. For the first time in a long time, Adrian did not immediately reach for a solution. He sat with the uncertainty instead, watching a woman who had nothing he could take and nothing he could offer that she seemed to need, and the realization settled quietly, almost uncomfortably, that whatever had just passed between them was not finished, not because she had said more, but because she had said just enough to leave him thinking long after she had moved on. The envelope remained on the table long after Clara stepped away, its presence no longer commanding attention but quietly demanding it, like a question left unanswered in a room that had already moved on. Adrian did not touch it. Instead, he reached for the check presenter, opening it slowly, his movements deliberate, as if giving himself time to think, though he rarely needed it. The total was precise, clean, itemized down to the last detail, nothing hidden, nothing excessive. He stared at the numbers for a moment, then closed it again without reaching for his card. Across the dining room, Clara had resumed her rhythm completely, her focus shifting seamlessly from one table to the next, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as though nothing in her world had been disrupted. That, more than anything, unsettled him. He was used to causing reactions. Even silence, when it came, usually carried weight, tension, something that acknowledged his presence. But Clara's silence felt different. It did not acknowledge him at all. Near the bar, a manager's voice rose slightly, controlled but sharp, directed at the same young server Clara had helped earlier. The girl stood still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron, her eyes fixed downward as the manager gestured toward a tray of glassware, one piece missing from its place. "We count inventory every night," he said, his tone clipped, "and when something is missing, it comes out of someone's responsibility." The server nodded quickly, her voice barely audible as she tried to explain, but her words did not seem to reach him. Clara noticed from across the room. She paused for half a second, just long enough to assess, then walked over without urgency, her steps calm, her expression neutral. "Excuse me," she said softly, addressing the manager with a respectful tone that did not challenge but did not retreat either. "I moved one of the glasses earlier to replace a chipped one at table 6. It is already in the dishwasher." The manager hesitated, his eyes shifting briefly toward the kitchen entrance, then back to Clara. The tension in his posture eased slightly. "Next time, log it," he said, less sharply now. Before turning away, the young server exhaled, her shoulders dropping, relief washing over her face. "Thank you," she whispered again, and Clara gave the same small nod as before, as if gratitude was unnecessary for something that should have been normal. Adrian watched the entire exchange without interruption, something in it settling deeper than the moment itself, because there had been no hesitation in Clara's voice, no attempt to make herself look better, no expectation of acknowledgement. She had simply stepped in, redirected the outcome, and stepped away. No transaction, no benefit, just a quiet correction. He leaned forward slightly now, his elbows resting lightly on the table, his gaze no longer distant but focused, following Clara as she returned to her section. The envelope sat untouched beside the check presenter, its edges no longer sharp in his mind, its purpose less certain. For the first time, Adrian considered something he rarely allowed himself to consider, not as a strategy, not as a calculation, but as a question without an immediate answer. What if the problem was not the price, but the assumption behind it? He picked up the envelope then, not to open it, not to push it forward again, but simply to feel its weight in his hand, as if measuring something that had nothing to do with money. Across the room, Clara glanced briefly in his direction, not with concern, not with curiosity, but with the same calm awareness she carried through everything she did. Their eyes met for only a second. She gave no signal, no reaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that did not invite anything further. And yet, that brief moment lingered longer than it should have, leaving Adrian with the unfamiliar sense that whatever control he thought he had in this situation had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that he could feel it, like a balance he had always relied on adjusting without his permission. Adrian turned the envelope slowly in his hand, the crisp edges no longer carrying the same certainty they had just minutes ago. And for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was holding a solution, but something unfinished, something that had not worked the way it always did, and that unfamiliar outcome lingered longer than he was comfortable admitting. He placed the envelope back on the table, this time not pushing it forward, not positioning it as an offer, but setting it down as if it no longer belonged to the moment at all. Around him, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, plates moving, conversations blending into a soft background hum, the kind of environment where nothing seemed out of place unless you were paying attention. And now, he was paying attention. Clara approached his table again, not with hesitation, not with caution, but with the same calm professionalism she had carried all evening, her posture steady, her expression neutral, as if this was simply another step in a routine that did not need to be altered. "Would you like anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice even, offering service without expectation. Adrian looked up at her, really looked this time, not as a variable to be managed, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person he did not yet understand, and that alone was enough to hold his attention longer than usual. "No," he said after a moment, then paused, something in his expression shifting slightly, not softer, but less certain. "Actually, yes." Clara waited, not leaning in, not prompting, simply present in a way that did not rush him. "Sit for a minute," he added, gesturing lightly to the empty chair across from him, his tone controlled but lacking the usual assumption that his request would be accepted without question. Clara's eyes flicked briefly toward the dining room, toward the other table she was responsible for, then back to him, her expression thoughtful but not conflicted. "I have other tables," she replied quietly, not as a refusal, but as a statement of fact. Adrian nodded once, acknowledging it, and for a moment, he almost let it go, almost returned to the familiar distance that separated him from people like her. But something held him there. "5 minutes," he said, not insisting, not commanding, just offering the space as a possibility rather than a demand. Clara studied him for a second longer, then gave a small nod, setting her order pad down on the edge of the table before taking the seat across from him with a posture that remained composed, professional even in stillness. She did not relax into the chair. She did not lean forward. She simply sat, present but guarded in a way that felt intentional. Adrian noticed that immediately. "You knew what I was asking," he said, his voice lower now, not testing, but searching. Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." "And you still walked away," he continued, as if saying it out loud might help him understand it better. "Yes." The simplicity of her answers carried no edge, no attempt to prove anything, just clarity, and that clarity made it difficult to dismiss. Adrian rested his hands lightly on the table, his fingers no longer tapping, his usual restlessness replaced by something quieter. "Most people would not," he said. Clara tilted her head slightly, considering that, then gave a small, almost thoughtful response. "Most people are not in the same place," she said. Adrian frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in curiosity. "What place is that?" he asked. Clara's gaze did not waver, her voice steady as she answered. "The place where you decide what is yours to keep and what is not." The words settled between them, simple on the surface, but carrying something deeper, something that did not fit neatly into the way Adrian understood transactions. He studied her for a long moment, the noise of the restaurant fading slightly as his focus narrowed. "And silence is yours to keep?" he asked. Clara shook her head gently. "No," she said, her voice soft but certain. "My integrity is." The distinction was subtle, but it landed with a weight Adrian could not ignore, because it reframed everything he had assumed about the situation, about her, about the envelope still resting untouched beside them. For the first time that night, he did not respond immediately. He simply sat there, looking at her, as the realization began to form, slow and unfamiliar, that this conversation was no longer about what she had heard, or what he could offer, but about something far more difficult to negotiate, something that could not be measured, and for once, could not be bought. Adrian did not look away after she spoke, and for a moment, the space between them felt different, quieter, as if the usual noise of transactions and expectations had been pushed to the edges, leaving only something more difficult to define. He leaned back slightly, his posture no longer carrying the same rigid control, his attention still fixed on Clara, as though he were trying to understand not just her words, but the place they came from. Integrity, he repeated, not as a challenge, but as if testing how the word felt when spoken aloud, and it sounded unfamiliar, almost distant, like something he had once known but had not used in a very long time. Clara did not react to the repetition. She simply sat there, composed, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her shoulders relaxed, but her presence unmistakably firm. There was no performance in her stillness, no attempt to persuade, just quiet certainty. Adrian exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting for a second toward the window where the rain had softened into a steady, almost rhythmic pattern, then back to her. "You realize," he said carefully, "that by refusing, you are not changing what already happened." Clara nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that statement without resistance. "I am not trying to change it," she replied. "Then what are you trying to do?" he asked, his voice lower now, more measured, as if the question mattered more than he intended to admit. Clara considered that for a brief moment, her eyes steady, her expression thoughtful. "I am deciding what I carry with me after I walk away," she said. The answer was simple, but it did not feel small, and Adrian found himself holding on to it longer than expected, turning it over in his mind the way he would analyze a contract or a negotiation. Except this time, there was no clause to adjust, no leverage to apply. Just a statement that stood on its own. He glanced down at the envelope again, then pushed it slightly, not toward her, but to the side, as if removing it from the center of the conversation. The motion was subtle, but it marked a shift he could feel more than see. "And you think I should do the same?" he said, not quite a question, not quite a conclusion. Clara did not rush to answer. When she spoke, her voice remained calm, almost gentle. "I think everyone has to decide what they are willing to carry," she said. Adrian let out a quiet breath, something between a sigh and a pause, his fingers resting still on the table now, no longer searching for control in small movements. For the first time that evening, he was not thinking about outcomes, not calculating risk or advantage, but simply sitting with the weight of a choice that did not come with clear instructions. Across the room, a soft laugh rose from another table, the sound light and unburdened, and it contrasted sharply with the quiet intensity at their table. Clara noticed the time with a brief glance toward the clock above the bar, then back at Adrian. "I should get back," she said, her tone respectful but final, not asking for permission, just stating what needed to happen next. Adrian nodded, not immediately, but after a second, as if accepting something he could not yet fully explain. "Of course," he said. Clara stood, smoothing the front of her uniform with a small, practiced motion, her composure unchanged, her presence steady as she stepped away from the table once more. Adrian watched her go, but this time there was no attempt to stop her, no instinct to redirect the moment back into something familiar. He remained where he was, the envelope now sitting off to the side, no longer central, no longer decisive, and for the first time in years, he allowed a thought to surface without immediately dismissing it. Not every silence is something you buy. Some silences are something you earn or lose. And as Clara moved through the dining room, already absorbed in her work, Adrian realized with a quiet clarity that whatever had just shifted inside him was not because she had argued, or resisted, or fought. It was because she had not moved at all. The rain had softened into a fine mist by the time the dinner rush began to thin, and the restaurant shifted into that quieter hour, where conversation slowed and movements became more deliberate, as if the night itself was exhaling. Clara moved through her section with the same steady rhythm, clearing plates, refilling glasses, offering small acknowledgments that required no words, her focus anchored in the present, unaffected by the conversation she had left behind. At table 12, Adrian remained seated longer than most guests would have, his posture composed but no longer rigid, his attention drifting between the room and the thoughts that refused to settle as neatly as he preferred. The envelope still sat off to the side, untouched, its presence now almost irrelevant, and that alone marked a shift he could not ignore. He picked up the check presenter again, this time opening it with intention, his movements slower, more considered, as if each step required a different kind of awareness than he was used to applying. He reached into his jacket and removed his card, placing it inside without hesitation, but even that familiar action felt different, less automatic, as though it carried a weight beyond the simple act of paying a bill. When Clara returned to collect it, she did so without ceremony, her expression unchanged, her attention precise. She did not glance at the envelope. She did not acknowledge it. She simply took the presenter, her fingers steady, her movements efficient. Adrian watched her for a moment, then spoke, his voice quieter than before, not to command, not to test, but to understand. "Clara," he said, using her name for the first time, and the way it settled in the space between them felt deliberate. She paused, just slightly, acknowledging him with a brief look that was neither inviting nor distant. "Yes, sir," she replied. Adrian hesitated, something rare enough that he noticed it immediately, then let the question come without refinement. "If you had taken it," he said, nodding faintly toward the envelope, "what would have changed?" Clara considered that, her gaze steady, her expression thoughtful but not conflicted. "For you?" she asked quietly. Adrian nodded once. "Nothing," she said simply. The answer came without hesitation, without emphasis, and yet it landed with a clarity that made it difficult to dismiss. Adrian held her gaze, searching for something more, an explanation, a justification, but she offered neither, just the answer as it stood. "And for you?" he asked after a moment. Clara's eyes did not waver. "Everything," she said. The distinction was immediate, undeniable, and it shifted something in Adrian's understanding in a way that no argument could have achieved. He leaned back slightly, absorbing that, the simplicity of it, the weight of it, the way it reframed the entire exchange into something he had not considered before. Clara gave a small nod, the same quiet signal that marked the end of an interaction, and turned to continue her work, her attention already moving forward. But Adrian did not return to his phone, did not retreat into the familiar patterns that usually followed a completed transaction. Instead, he remained still, his gaze drifting once more to the envelope, then back to the room, to the people who moved through it without calculation, without negotiation. For the first time in a long while, he felt the absence of something he had always assumed was present, a kind of certainty that had guided his decisions, and in its place was a question that did not demand an immediate answer, only recognition. And as Clara disappeared into the rhythm of the restaurant once more, Adrian realized that what she had refused was not just the money, but the premise behind it, and that refusal had left him with something far more difficult to resolve than silence ever could. The card was returned within minutes, placed neatly inside the check presenter with the same quiet precision Clara had shown all evening, and Adrian signed the receipt without looking at the total again, his signature steady but slower than usual, as if each movement carried a weight that had nothing to do with the bill itself. He left a tip that was generous by any standard, but not excessive, not performative, just enough to reflect something measured rather than something purchased, and when he closed the presenter, his hand paused briefly before pulling away. The envelope remained where it had been set earlier, untouched, its presence now almost out of place, like an object that no longer belonged to the moment it was meant to control. Adrian stood, adjusting his jacket with a small, practiced motion, his posture returning to its familiar composure. But something in his expression had shifted, something quieter, less certain, as though a part of him had stepped back to reconsider what he had always moved through without question. Clara approached once more, collecting the presenter with a nod that was professional, neutral, unchanged. She did not check the tip in front of him. She did not acknowledge the envelope. She simply did her job, the same way she had done it from the beginning, with consistency that did not depend on what she received in return. "Thank you for coming in," she said, her voice calm, her tone neither warm nor distant, just respectful in a way that did not assume anything more. Adrian hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached for the envelope, lifting it from the table, not to offer it again, not to insist, but to remove it from a space where it had failed to serve its purpose. He held it in his hand, feeling its weight one last time before slipping it back into the inside pocket of his jacket, the motion deliberate, final. "Clara," he said again, and she paused, turning slightly to face him, her attention steady. "You were right," he added, the words simple, without elaboration, without defense. Clara studied him for a brief moment, not searching for sincerity, not testing his tone, just acknowledging the statement as it was given. "Good night, sir," she replied, her voice soft, her expression unchanged, and in that response there was no validation, no reinforcement, just a quiet closure that did not extend beyond the moment. Adrian gave a small nod, something almost instinctive, then turned and walked toward the exit, his steps measured, his pace unhurried, as if leaving required more thought than arriving ever had. The door opened, and the cool air from outside brushed against him, carrying the faint scent of rain that had nearly faded into mist. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, the city stretching around him in familiar patterns of light and motion, taxis passing, people moving with purpose, everything exactly as it had been before. And yet, something felt different, not in the world around him, but in the way he was seeing it, as if a layer he had relied on for years had shifted just enough to reveal something underneath. He paused for a moment under the awning, his hand resting lightly against the inside of his jacket where the envelope now sat, no longer a tool, no longer a solution, just paper carrying a value that suddenly felt less certain than it had an hour ago. Across the glass, he could see Clara moving through the restaurant, already absorbed in her work, her presence unchanged, her rhythm steady, as if nothing from that evening would follow her beyond those walls. Adrian watched for a second longer, then turned away, stepping into the night without looking back again, not because the moment had ended, but because it had already done what it needed to do, leaving behind a quiet understanding that would not fade as easily as the rain. The night carried on, but something in Adrian did not return to its usual rhythm, and even as the city moved around him with its predictable urgency, his thoughts remained anchored to a quiet table, a simple refusal, and a woman who had not raised her voice, had not argued, had not demanded anything in return, yet had managed to leave a mark deeper than any negotiation he had ever won. The following morning arrived with its usual structure, sunlight filtering through the tall windows of his office, assistants moving efficiently, schedules laid out with precision. But Adrian found himself pausing more often than usual, his attention drifting between tasks, not out of distraction, but out of reflection. On his desk sat a folder containing the decision he had nearly finalized the night before, a strategic move that would protect his firm while quietly placing the burden of failure on someone who had trusted the system to be fair. It was legal. It was efficient. It was what everyone expected him to do. Adrian rested his hand on the folder, his fingers tracing its edge without opening it, the memory of Clara's voice surfacing again, not loud, not insistent, just present in a way that did not fade. "I am deciding what I carry with me after I walk away." He leaned back in his chair, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass, and for a moment, he allowed himself to consider something he would normally dismiss as impractical. Not the outcome, not the cost, but the weight of the choice itself. Down the hall, his assistant knocked lightly before stepping in, her expression composed. "The board is ready for your final approval," she said. Adrian nodded, his posture steady, his voice calm when he responded. "Give me 5 minutes." She hesitated briefly, then nodded and stepped out, closing the door behind her. The room fell quiet. Adrian opened the folder slowly this time, reading through the documents again, not for accuracy, not for loopholes, but for something else, something harder to define. The names, the consequences, the path that would follow once the decision was signed. He closed it again after a moment, his jaw tightening slightly, not from pressure, but from clarity. Then, without calling anyone in, without announcing it, he reached for a pen and made a small but decisive change, one that shifted the outcome, one that required more from him, not less. It was not the easiest option. It was not the most profitable, but it was the one he could carry. Later that afternoon, as the meeting concluded with quiet surprise and careful acknowledgement from those around the table, Adrian did not explain his reasoning. He did not justify it. He simply moved forward, his decisions aligning in a way they had not before, not driven by control, but by something steadier, something he had not realized he had been missing. Days passed, then a week, and on a quiet evening that felt almost identical to the one before, Adrian found himself standing once again outside the same restaurant. The soft glow of lights spilling onto the sidewalk, the faint sound of conversation drifting through the glass. He stepped inside without hesitation this time, his gaze moving naturally toward the dining room, searching not with urgency, but with quiet intention. Clara was there, moving through her section with the same calm precision, her presence unchanged, her rhythm steady, as if the world had not shifted at all. Adrian took a seat, not in the private corner, not behind closed doors, but at a table open to the room, where nothing was hidden and nothing needed to be. When Clara approached, she recognized him, not with surprise, not with expectation, but with the same composed acknowledgement she offered every guest. "Good evening," she said. Adrian met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no distance in his voice when he replied. "Good evening, Clara." There was no envelope this time, no offer, no test, just a man who had walked away from one decision and returned with another. Clara gave a small nod, taking his order with the same steady hand, the same quiet focus, and as she turned to continue her work, nothing about her changed. She did not need to, because some people do not raise their voice to change a moment. They simply stand still, and in that